Hello, and welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and today I'll be bringing you part 2 in our short series on New Zealand writer Janet Frame. Trigger warnings for this episode include mention of child abuse and child death. The main source I'll be using is Janet Frame's autobiography, To the Island. All other sources will be listed at the end of the episode transcript. So come on in and get comfortable as we let Janet Frame take us behind the walls of Seacliff Mental Hospital. Janet Frame was born in Dunedin, New Zealand on August 28, 1924. Her father, George Frame, was a World War I veteran who worked for the New Zealand Railway. George Frame married Janet's mother, Lottie, 3 weeks before he left for war. Together, George and Lottie became parents to daughter Myrtle in 1920, son Robert in 1922, an unnamed stillborn son in 1923, Janet in 1924, daughter Isabel in 1926, and daughter June in 1928. Frame recounts the story of her birth. I was delivered by Dr. Emily Seideberg McKinnon at St. Helens Hospital in Dunedin, where I was known as the baby who was always hungry. I had a twin which did not develop beyond a few weeks. Twins were hereditary in Mother's family, and she would often quote the poem written by, I think, her grandmother, whose 2 sets of twins died in infancy. 4 little locks of gold. Mother's memory of my birth always had 2 repeated references. Her boast that I was delivered by the first woman medical graduate in New Zealand, and her pride in the abundance of milk that enabled her to feed myself and other babies." End quote. When Frame was only 3 weeks old, the family moved from Dunedin to a farm Outram that had cows and a large walnut tree in the back. She grew up watching her family tend to the cows and spending time with extended family who lived nearby. And when she was 3 years old, they left the Outram for Glenham. In their new town, their first home, which was meant to be temporary, was not particularly conducive for a family with young children, especially during the cold months. Quote, "There were 3 railway huts, possibly a 4th with a copper to be used as a wash house, a kitchen living hut, a bedroom hut with bunks for Myrtle, Bruddy, and me, and a bedroom for Mum and Dad and the baby Isabel, each hut being about 6 feet by 8 feet, except for the slightly larger kitchen living hut, which had a stove with a tin chimney poking through the roof. Each hut was painted railway red and had its own door. The lavatory, or dumpy as we called it, was the usual enclosure about a deep hole with a railway red seat. Our lighting was by candle and kerosene, and only the kitchen hut had a stove. It always seemed to be snowing, with the snow lying deep around the huts and in the central courtyard. I think I knew unhappiness for the first time. I was miserable, locked away each night from Mom and Dad, and unable to reach them except by going through the snow. I was at an age to be teased, and because I had let it be known that I was afraid of rats in the wall, I was teased with cries of, "Rats in the wall, rats in the wall." We were all sick with colds, and I began to suffer the pains in my legs that became part of my childhood. I was feverish and delirious, seeing insects crawling up and down the wall. The growing pains and the fever were rheumatic fever. Everywhere was damp and cold." End quote. Now, I've mentioned that I love Janet Frame's writing. One of the beautiful stylistic moves that she makes is punctuating a short sentence followed by a freakishly long sentence. It's lovely until you have to read it out loud. So bear with me on the next one. It's a little long. She mentions that the family only stays in the huts through the cold weather months, and then they move to Edendale. Quote, "It was late summer when we shifted into our rebuilt house at Edendale, into the heart of our railway country, beside the railway line, and the goods shed and the engine shed and the turntable and the points and the water tank painted Railway Hut red on its Railway Hut red stand beside the railway line, and the spindly red-painted little house high up where the signalman lived and hung out his signals, and the resting or retired railway cages and trucks and trolleys. Among our games was Trolley Works, where we pretended to be trolleys on the railway line. I spent much time playing around the railway territory, among the railway weeds and flowers, dock and wild sweet peas, and in the goods shed where the sacks of grain were piled high, and I, suddenly powerful as a jackdaw, climbed on top of the sacks, or climbers as we knew them, and swooped down on Myrtle and Bruddy, flapping my wings and making a hawk-like cry. "Neenie's the jackdaw," they said at meals when Mum or Dad asked what we'd been doing. "Neenie's a jackdaw, and we've been climbing up the climbers." I'd not seen jackdaws, but I'd heard stories of the way they swooped upon bright objects to carry them to their next. It seemed that we had scarcely settled in our new old house when word came that we were to shift once again to Wyndham. End quote. They moved to another railway house by the railway line on Ferry Street in Wyndham. The family didn't have a lot of money, but they seemed to enjoy each other's company. Lottie, Janet's mother, played the accordion and sang and wrote poems for the local paper. George, her father, played the bagpipes and painted and told silly stories. She had the usual contentious relationships with her siblings, and at home she was known as Jean or Nini. When she started school, Frame was known as Jean there too. She attended along with her older siblings, Myrtle and Robert, for a while until they transferred once again from Wyndham to Oamaru in the north of Otago. Fortunately for the family, they would remain at their next home for many years, 56 Eden Street in Oamaru. This was the first time they had been in a true neighborhood, and I love the way that Frame describes her mother's reaction to it. Quote, "Seeing the long street and rows of houses, especially the houses overlooking and surrounding us, Mother panicked, speaking in her earthquake and lightning voice. 'We've never been surrounded by houses before,' she said, as if the fact were a national and world disaster that caused us, too, to sense the enormity of Oamaru, where houses and people and streets replaced our familiar landscape of wild spaces, southland skies with their shimmerings of Antarctic ice, paddocks of cattle and sheep, dark swamps and brown rivers where each day and night could be felt in its existence, and the grass and the insects in the grass could speak and be heard." End quote. Frame started school at Oamaru North School, where she was in Standard 1. Now, I had to look this up since, for some reason, I'm not familiar with the New Zealand education system back in the 1930s. So, not sure why that might be. And I found that it's the equivalent to third grade. And she seemed to be a typical kid. She loved to play, loved to help, loved to learn. It was this year, she said, that she learned the word island, only she said it island. And her older sister Myrtle was all too happy to correct her. "I read a story to the island about some children going to an island." "It's island," Myrtle corrected. "It's not," I said. "It's island. It says," and I spelled the letter, ISLAND, island. "It's a silent letter," Myrtle said, "like knee." In the end, reluctantly, I had to accept the rule, although within myself I still thought of it as the island. End quote. And I love that little anecdote because how many of us have read a word 1,000 times? We know what it is, we know what it means, but then we realize we have no idea how it's actually pronounced. I know Janet Frame and I aren't the only ones who experienced this. Now, this was also an age when Frame realized that she was allowed to make up an adventure like a story, and with that opened up so many possibilities. But she had a hard time with it. Her peers were making up stories about visits to museums and zoos and faraway cities, but she couldn't think of anything. And this sounds a little like concrete thinking, which is common in kids who are usually younger than Janet is here. Another way of talking about concrete thinking is black and white thinking. The person takes everything at face value and has a really hard time with nuance. So To help Frame and her peers develop their imaginations, the teacher came up with an activity to make the observations on their way to and from school. And she seemed to love this activity and used the time to find new routes to and from school, noticing all the goings on and people that she came across. And I can't help but think that this must have kickstarted her love of descriptive prose. From the time they had moved to Amaru, Frame's paternal grandfather had been living with the family, and he died in his sleep one night. But Frame noted that it seemed to be an event more for the grown-ups than for her or her siblings. The death of her grandfather was eclipsed by a significant event in their family. Frame's older brother Robert, whom they called Bruddy, had a seizure one evening, and the scene was chaos, her mother frantically searching for the doctor's book on what to do and attempting to calm their young son. In the meanwhile, the other Frame children were left on their own, scared and unsure of what was happening, and the long night turned out to be a turning point for the family. Quote, "Our lives were changed suddenly. Our brother had epilepsy," the doctor said, prescribing large doses of bromide, which, combined with Bruddy's now frequent attacks, or fits as everyone called them, only increased his confusion and fear until each day at home there were episodes of violent rage when he attacked us or threw whatever was at hand to throw. There had usually been somewhere within our family to find a place, however cramped. Now there seemed to be no place. A cloud of unreality and disbelief filled our home, and some of the resulting penetrating rain had the composition of real tears." End quote. We have to remember the larger context of what this all means. Yes, it would be absolutely terrifying to see your child experience seizures, but this was the early 20th century. People with epilepsy were frequently sent away to institutions for the rest of their lives. It was clear that Frame's mother did not want to see her son sent away, so she held him extra close at the expense of her other children. Frame says that her mother spent so much time with Robert that the girls were essentially left to live on their own to survive, with occasional help from their dad. All of this, from a trauma-informed perspective, had to be extremely difficult for Frame and her sisters. They're still quite young and see their brother get violent almost every day. Frame had said there was no safe place at home. That, along with their mother suddenly tending to their brother all the time, had to be quite a difficult shift. And this starts to leak out in the form of psychiatric and somatic symptoms. Quote, "Anyone observing me during those days would have seen an anxious child full of twitches and tics, standing alone at the playground in school, wearing day after day the same hand-me-down tartan skirt that was almost stiff with constant wear, for it was all I had to wear. A freckle-faced, frizzy-haired little girl who was somehow dirty because the lady doctors chose her with the other known dirty and poor children for a special examination in that narrow room next to the teacher's room. I had tide marks of dirt behind my knees and my inner arms, and when I saw them, I felt a wave of shock to know that they were there when I had been sure I had washed thoroughly." End quote. The home life wasn't much better. Again, to contextualize all of this, this is happening during the Great Depression. Her father's salary at the railway was cut, and he feared he was going bankrupt because of all the doctor bills. Frame recalled seeing her father sit at the end of the table, leaning his head in his hands and saying, "Mom, I'm going bankrupt. I'll go mad and shoot myself. I'll go down and jump over the wharf." And again, this would be traumatic for a young girl, hearing her dad openly talk about how he wanted to die by suicide. Her reading was her only escape during those hard times. And years went by. Her father no longer played the bagpipes. Her mother no longer played the accordion. There was no more singing in the evenings. All of their creative outlets were put away. Frame's oldest sister Myrtle was involved in theater and sports and collapsed one day while running. She was brought home and diagnosed with a heart defect that could end her life at any moment. Myrtle was encouraged to leave school, and she ended up working for a local widow to earn some money. It was during this time that Myrtle and Janet became particularly close. Isabel and June formed a duo as the youngest sisters, and Robert and his mother became the odd pair out. The parents must have been desperate for a treatment to fix Robert and his seizures so that he wouldn't have to go to an institution. And for a while, and trigger warning here for abuse, they believed Robert could stop his seizures if he just tried hard enough. Quote, the doctor's mother said were little help, prescribing medicine that made Bruddy more confused and angry and stupid when he was a bright little boy who had walked and talked earlier than the others except Myrtle. It was Dad's opinion that Bruddy could stop his fits if he wanted to. And for a time, Mother, influenced by Dad's certainty, joined the cry. Stop it, Bruddy! Stop it at once! When the familiar signs of an attack began to show. Someone suggested the illness could be beaten out of him, and Dad did whip him once or twice to try and cure him. This failed, of course, but Dad maintained that Bruddy could stop it if he wanted to. The answer, he said, was discipline and willpower. End quote. She goes on to say that they tried other potential cures for Robert, chiropractic work, diet changes, but nothing worked. Meanwhile, the other children were left to run around wild, and run around wild they did. Until one day the health inspector showed up and threatened to send the children to welfare if they didn't straighten up their act. And I know I sound repetitive, but I want to show and point out how all of this must have been traumatic for young Janet. If we think about it, she's learning from her parents that a physical illness like epilepsy can be cured with discipline and willpower. The underlying lesson is that he can't be fixed because he's just not strong enough, or he just doesn't want to enough. So keep that in the back of your mind, because if a physical illness could be volitional, imagine what they would think of a mental illness. It doesn't help that her own family would make fun of her quirks and stress responses. She talked about how her dad would chase around her youngest sister June while he wore his gas mask from World War I just because it scared her. Like, okay, jerk. And the game with me, Janet said, was to stand me in the middle of the room where everyone could observe my twitches and tics and the funny faces I pulled, and the more I stopped, the harder it became. Just look at her, look at her. She's got the St. Vitus's dance, Dad would mock, end quote. St. Vitus dance is another name for rheumatic chorea, which you might remember Frame mentioned earlier when she was talking about getting rheumatic fever. This type of chorea, or jerky limb movements, happens in a relatively small percentage of children and adolescents who get rheumatic fever. It would eventually go away, but Frame had mentioned that the jerks in her legs were particularly bad through her younger years. And not cool for her dad to be making fun of these movements that she couldn't even control. I know he would make me feel very insecure and ashamed for something that wasn't my fault. When Frame advanced to Standard 4, or 6th grade, she suddenly became the teacher's favorite. She wrote a poem that she was particularly fond of that the teacher also liked. She took it home, and suddenly her father was very proud of her. And when I read that part, I thought, there it is. She's been longing for her dad's acceptance of her, but didn't get it until then. So in her mind, without even maybe realizing it, she learned that good writing means making Dad proud of me. So, of course, she had to continue to write well in order to please him. So when she won the prestigious Dux Medal at the end of the school year, her father was exceptionally proud, especially when she won a year's subscription to the Athenaeum, which was the Amaru Public Library, an honor for her. You can imagine the joy she must have felt. An aspiring writer getting a year's subscription to the local library, it probably opened up so many opportunities for her. Now, as we discussed in episode 61, the Labor government was elected in 1935. This changed a lot for the Frame family. Her father, you remember, had been on the verge of suicide because of the level of their medical debt. Having a child with epilepsy could not have been easy and would have also been expensive. So here's how Frame describes the change for her family. Quote, the election of the Labor government was almost like a second coming. So great was the joy in our household. And so revered the new Prime Minister, Mickey Savage, whose poster-sized photograph was now pinned to our kitchen wall, where it stayed for the rest of the time we lived at 56 Eden Street. When the Social Security Act was finally passed, Dad, in a spontaneous dance of delight in which the family joined, removed the bills from behind the clock and, taking the poker from its hook by the stove, lifted the cover and thrust all the bills into the fire. Mother, a true Godfrey, because all the Godfreys are known as weepers, wept, and we children made whooping cowboy shouts of joy. End quote. What a relief it had to be to suddenly go from being burdened to the point of death to having all those bills for their son's care suddenly forgiven. It was around this time that Frame began writing more and more poetry. She says, quote, I wrote poems about everything around me. I wrote a poem about the sand, the sky, the leaves, a rainbow, taking care to list the exact colors, orange, yellow, red, and heliotrope, a lovely green and blue. I wrote about Marie Antoinette and the Palace of Fontainebleau. Ah, Queen of Sorrows, I wish you were here. To see the sunset a beautiful pink, you might take a book and sit by the mirror, or stoop to the crystal and drink. The times are hard, the smiles are few, there is bloodshed and many men die. No time to look at the rain-washed blue or the sunset in the sky. Not too shabby for someone about 11 or 12 years old at that point. And she wanted to write well for herself, of course, but also to please her parents. Remember that her mother also wrote poetry and sent it off to local newspapers for publishing. I'm sure there was a drive to prove that she, Janet, could also be a good writer. It was around this time that she got the idea that writers who made it needed to have some sort of edge, something that separated them, made them unique from other writers. She noticed that many of the musicians and writers who performed on live radio were blind or had some sort of disability. And she internalized that like this, quote, I perceived that in a world where it was admirable to be brave and noble, it was more brave and noble to be writing poems if you were crippled or blind than if you had no disability. I longed to be struck with paralysis so that I might lie in bed all day or sit all day in a wheelchair writing stories and poems, end quote. It's an odd wish, to be sure, but shows how much her writing meant to her. Now, when school ended that year, Frame and two of her sisters, Myrtle and Isabel, talked about going swimming and hanging out with some of the boys downtown. And Janet decided she didn't want to go and fought with Myrtle about the decision. And I can see Myrtle as the older sister trying to egg her on. Come on, don't be like that. You have all summer to work on your homework. Don't be lame. Probably something like that. But in the end, Myrtle and Isabel left to go swimming with another friend, and Janet stayed behind. A couple hours later, while Janet was still getting herself prepped for school, there was a knock at the door, and her mother opened it to find a man standing there. The man looked at Janet, who was standing behind her mother, and said, Send that child away. And I'm sorry, but if someone I didn't know showed up at my front door and without any other context told my child to go away, I'd probably close the door right in his face. But Lottie Frame didn't do that. And Janet didn't leave. She stayed and listened. I'm a doctor, the man said. I've come to tell you about your daughter Myrtle. She's been drowned. They've taken her body to the morgue. And just like that, little Janet's whole life changed. Her oldest sister was gone, and the last thing she'd said to her had been an argument. And Frame had complex feelings around the death of her sister, as to be expected. She said, quote, At first I was glad, thinking there would be no more quarrels, crying, thrashing, with Dad trying to control her and angry with her, and us listening, frightened, pitying, and crying too. Then the sad fact came to me that there might be a prospect of peace, but the cost was the entire removal of Myrtle. Not just for a holiday or next door or downtown or anywhere in the world, but off the face of the earth and out of the world, a complete disappearance, and not even a trial just to see how it worked, end quote. I find that just to be such a lovely and heartbreaking way to capture the complexity of grief. So we need to take a step back for a moment and zoom out to look at Janet Frame's life thus far. Her family moved around a lot, so that can create instability, especially in her younger years. Her brother has a serious medical condition that put the family into debt for years, not to mention his violent actions when he'd get confused. There was a lot of fighting between family members and her dad's suicidal ideation. Now the death of her oldest sister. That's a lot of trauma for a young woman who hadn't even made it to her teen years. But she seemed to have found solace in writing and developing her imagination, and that happened to be her saving grace. Janet also sensed that she was different even within her family. Whereas Myrtle had been very social and gregarious, Janet was quiet and introverted. And Isabel was growing up to be a lot like Myrtle was, and in many ways, Isabel socially surpassed Janet, even though she was younger. Janet was the smart one, but being the smart one came with additional pressure. Here's what she said after her tutor called her brilliant. Quote, "This judgment pleased, confused, and frightened me with an intrusion of opinion and expectation that would now deny me the world of making music as a place of private escape. The performance of music was so present and public. My only escape was within myself, to my place, with an imagination that I was not even sure I possessed, but where I hoped to avoid the praising, blaming scrutiny of others. Therefore, although I was proud of being thought brilliant, I wanted to hide." And noting this, Jessie said to Mom, using that identity-destroying third person, "She's shy." End quote. And I relate to this a lot. The wanting to be known, but not wanting to stick out or be criticized. I want people to listen to my show, but not if they're not going to like it or not like me. And I think part of the reason why I enjoy Janet Frame's writing so much is because I relate to it. And clearly, other people do too. Janet's shyness starts to become a recurring theme throughout the book as she gets older, and it develops into a pretty significant insecurity and social anxiety. She said that she felt trapped by the opinions of others and different. So when a teacher said to her sister Isabel, "You frame girls think you're so different from everyone else," Janet said, quote, "I came to accept the difference, although in our world of school, to be different was to be peculiar, a little mad," end quote. It's poignant, I think, that she uses the word mad here as almost a type of foreshadowing. Frame was about 15 years old when World War II began. She was learning about eugenics in school and learning that certain types of people were bad, and she seemed confused by it all. Her writing took a dark turn to the theme of war and the tensions that she felt around town. It must have been a strange time to be coming of age and succeeding in school while there's so much unknown and fear around her. And she started wrestling with some big existential questions as she came to the end of her school years. Quote, "I felt bewildered, imprisoned. Where would I go? What if my parents died suddenly? What was the world like? How could the world be at war?" I asked myself that old question which haunted me as a child. Why was the world? Why was the world? And where was my place? I had those recurring dreams of being grown up and returning to school only to be told, "What are you doing here? You're grown up." End quote. Frame's last year of school, she said, was the cruelest. Her school uniform was uncomfortably tight, and the family couldn't afford to replace it. Even the way courses were conducted was different. Instead of sitting at desks in rows, they were now placed into small groups where they could have discussions. And this made Janet extremely uncomfortable, so she just stayed quiet. One of her biggest stressors was the future. She knew there would be an impending divide among her peers. Some would finish school at the end of the year and go to work at the factories until they got married or for the rest of their lives. Others, like her, would be able to continue with school and learn to become teachers. She knew she was lucky to be able to go to school, so why wasn't she excited about it? Her first book, To the Island, ends here at the end of her high school career. Her next book, An Angel at My Table, begins the next chapter of her life when she moves to Dunedin to begin university. And I think that's where I'll pause the story of Janet Frame for this week. I'd intended to tell her whole story in one episode, but I also think it's important to set the stage for what's about to come because, spoiler alert, we know that Janet Frame ends up in Seacliff Mental Hospital, but every patient's story is important. They aren't just their diagnosis or a set of symptoms. They have lived every day to the point of their hospital commitment. So I think it's important to see what Janet Frame lived through in her early years and to see how her mental illness formed. So far, we've seen her experience poverty, family troubles, multiple deaths, in addition to her own insecurities, social anxiety, and a sort of indecision about her future. And I'll point out that what we haven't seen are signs of severe mental illness. So come back next week to find out how Frame ended up at Seacliff and what life was like for her while she was there. That will be the final episode for this series on Seacliff Mental Hospital. I know I've learned a lot and I've really enjoyed the connections I've made with the people in Dunedin. So as always, thank you so much for listening. I really, really appreciate it. If you like the show, be sure to follow on Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. I'm trying to build my Instagram page because I'm way more of a Facebook girl, but so my Instagram page tends to get overlooked, but I haven't forgotten about it. So go check it out, give it a follow, and help me improve the page for everyone. Also a reminder, I'd mentioned a couple weeks ago that if you sign up and donate $5 a month on Patreon for at least 3 months, you can choose a hospital or sanatorium, there we go, for me to talk about on Patreon as special content. I think that would be fun. I have an Ask Me Almost Anything section on Patreon for you to add your questions about the show, about the hospitals we've covered, or about what it's like today working in a state hospital, at least as much as I'm able to say. Big special thanks this week to Sarah for talking about the show while flying cross country. And a huge, huge, huge thank you to Pam A for their monthly support of the show on Buzzsprout. Thank you so much. You can also support the show for $3 a month on Buzzsprout. It's a great way to help me to buy the books I purchased for the show and manage other expenses. Of course, one of the other ways you can support the show is to rate and review wherever you're listening, but especially if that's on Apple Podcasts. It looks like the last review we had was in April. So if you haven't left a review of the show and want to, now would be a great time. It helps the algorithm find new listeners, so it really does a lot for me and the show. And if you've listened this far, I want to reward you. I'll reward you with a joke that one of my patients recently told me. And I get kind of nervous sometimes when they say they have a joke, because often they're a little off color. But this one was really cute and silly. Why did the chicken go to the gym? To work on his pecs. So there you go. Silly joke of the week brought to you by one of my patients. Thank you for listening this week. Be sure to come back next week and to hear the rest of Janet Frame's story. But most of all, remember, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.